curator music artist. Ah, look. Yeah. Okay, we begin right away. This is not break time, sorry. You can bring your coffee and your beverage and whatever you have with you. So please come and sit down with us now. Not a break time. Coming up next, but not now. And for this session, please come close, come in. And those of you in the back, you will have to be quiet now, please. Okay, and those coming for this, come forward. It's a smaller group and we need the intimacy. Please do. I beg you. I beg you. Okay, coming forward. Those of you are staying. Those of you in the back, we have to ask you now, please, to sit down and be quiet. Please, those of you in the back now, please, not break time. Thank you. Okay, I'm coming back there. Okay, ce n'est pas la pause. This is not the pause. We have to ask you to be quiet, please. Shh, thank you, Dovrat, thank you. And here's Freya.
Just grabbing one thing. Well, here we are into our 7th session called Amplifications. My name is Freya Olofsson. I work in the middle of Canada, in Winnipeg, Manitoba. My background's initially through dance, through classical ballet, into contemporary dance, and all along I had a strong visual practice, and then subsequently did an MFA in new media. So the work I make now is very much video and performance, and on some cases sound. So I'm very curious to see our presenters today and hear what they have to say. First is Rasmus Holmbo, who will be presenting on sound performance, experiment, and event. And subsequently we'll have Oli Sorensen here, curating audiovisual performance events in London. So we'll start with Rasmus.
I'm on now. Okay, thank you. And thanks for having me here. It's a great pleasure. What I'm presenting today is part of my ongoing doctoral research, and I would like you to consider the following probably as a tentative and thematic posing of some questions and proposals rather than a well-researched set of answers. As you can probably see from this project title, questions of representation exist on numerous levels within my project. At the very least, as the representation of performance in the archive, the representation of sound in other media, the representation of embodied knowing, and the representation of curatorial practice in a dissertation project. My research is carried out in collaboration with Museum of Contemporary Art in Roskilde in Denmark. And this is a museum that has as its mission, and I quote, "to be a true museum of the living arts, to collect, research, and communicate the performative and living arts, to unite the local and the international research and communication, action and participation with contemplation and reflection." End quote. That's quite a bit. This institutional context and its practice of collecting living art makes any subversive claims or any anti-representational claims for performance arts problematic. Though, of course, such conceptions still live on in the ways we shape our understandings and appreciations. On the other hand, positions arguing that it is the documentation and the act of documenting that frames performance as such might seem a somewhat pessimistic promise for a time-based live art. In other words, such positions as formulated with greatest impact by Peggy Phelan and Philip Auslander, respectively, have to be mediated, if not for anything else, then for practical purposes. In this context, the British scholar Matthew Reason has pointed to an understanding where the complex interplay between documentation and disappearance is what constitutes performance as such. And Rebecca Schneider has taken it even further and questioned the concepts of ephemerality, of disappearance, and of loss, criticizing them for being built upon the Western logic of the archive. In her analysis, Schneider develops a model where she sees difference as a consequence of the repetitive acts inherent to performance, and resemblance as a part of the representational logic of the archive. In my research, this basic notion of difference that Schneider touches upon is interesting and possibly productive as a way to try to avoid dominant tales, both of disappearance and loss, as well as those of the archival endeavor as a limiting fixation of performance's immediacy. Before I return to this notion of difference, I would like to give you a sense of the artistic field that I'm currently interested in by showing you a short snippet of documentation. The clip shows a performance that I attended as audience last October. I ripped it off the organizer's YouTube channel, which is probably a point that could make my critique of it, my later critique, seem a little unfair, as it was obviously made and distributed with different intentions and objectives than the one I'm pursuing in my research. However, it serves as quite a good example of the artistic field I'm interested in, and also it shows some of the curatorial challenges when working in an intermediate field. And further, it also actually points to some of the connections and the interdependencies between curating and documenting. So here it goes. And do we have sound? So, the term sound performance points to a rather fuzzy place in between experimental music, performing arts, dance, visual arts, and sound art, which in itself is a highly hybrid term. And as such, it's safe to say that sound performance is intermedial. When I spoke to Klaus Haxholm, one of the artists, after the performance, he told me that it was, and I quote, the choreography that was essential in this piece. We deliberately performed it with a certain twist of Danish, heavy-bodied sloppiness to soften the strict minimalism that the piece could otherwise easily evoke. The electric guitars were chosen as props because of their heavily iconic status, but we hadn't tuned them in any certain way before we started. So the sound was not an intentional expression in itself, but a consequence of the movement, end quote. As opposed to the more musically minded contexts in which they also work, here the artist wanted to shift the attention away from the sounding material or the musical narrative or composition, and more towards and attention to the significance of the instrument by using it in this dance-like situation. They'd been expecting to perform not on stage, but on the floor among the audience, as they usually do for this type of performance. The reason they didn't was an obvious curatorial choice on convenience on behalf of the organizers. The room already had a stage and not sufficient floor space for both performers and audience. So they put it on the stage, as that was the easiest thing to do. But in doing this, the organizers, of course, also imparted other perspectives on the performance than was the intention. Changing the relation between audience and artists both changed the perception of authority and the perception of sound. As for the authority, artists on stage wielding guitars simply tend to look more like rock stars than artists on the floor in a circle doing the same thing. And thus the movements and postures could be understood almost as a simple ironic pun on the guitar icon. You might even say that in highlighting the iconic status of the guitars in this particular way, the symbol value was made ambiguous and maybe even counterproductive to the sense of choreography, physical work, and movement as material that the artists were aiming at. The other thing, in offering the audience a very musical-like and flat stereo image of the sound as opposed to a spatial one, a concert setting was evoked that stimulated the focus on sound as musical narrative and as composition. So the decision to put the performers on stage and not on the floor changed the relation between performance and audience radically in ways that greatly impacted the expression, all of which is probably due to genre-specific or institutional conventions that are embedded in our understandings of any performance. And as such, social and institutional and disciplinary divides, however openly different disciplines conceive of themselves, always have to be addressed when working in an intermediate field. As for the documentation of the performance, the rather static camera, the poor sound quality is, I suppose, good enough for people to get acquainted with things on the internet. It's a record of what happened from a certain perspective, and this perspective reproduces and even emphasizes the curatorial bending of ideas that are just posed as specific problems. Making the experience two-dimensional underlines the narrative even more on behalf of the spatial and the process related. Further, what you saw was a clip that I made, an edit from a longer clip that I ripped off YouTube. So basically I made a mediation of what was already a mediation. And in doing so, I was not aware if camera position, angle, zooms, pans, and so on had been thought of consciously, let alone discussed with the artists, or if they were just accidental or the most convenient. So of course that's a further misrepresentation of the performance, yet it was what I chose to show you due to the format of the conference paper and time. And this testifies to the truly arbitrary and contingent nature of documentation when it is seen as something that is done on the side out of obligation or as extraneous to the curatorial core activities. An important point that can also be drawn from this is that documenting and archiving are marked by all the curatorial choices and problems involved in staging a performance, which is important if documenting is pursued as an activity that is actively engaging with a matter of performance and not merely as a recording of events that testifies to prove that something happened. So within my research connected to the museum, this means that curating and commissioning works also must involve a critical rethinking of the documentation strategies and formats best suited to any specific work in question. If curating is essentially about the delicate balance of communicating ideas and making things happen, it might then be worth to ask what it is exactly we want to document and why we do it. Do we want to present the intentions of the artist and or maybe the curator? Or do we focus on the audience's experience of the performance? Or might it be that the whole concept of presentation and representation, understood in oppositional terms of performance and the archive, has to be readdressed from a practical point of view, that acknowledges that both live art and documentation are always experienced as both presentation and representation. In this context, the pure or authentic experience also has to be questioned, because what is that after all but a contingent assemblage of different impressions made significant by an equally contingent assemblage of possible meaning on behalf of the individual audience member. Indeed, producing documentation with the intention of showing what actually happened is problematic in terms of representation for more reasons than just the relation between live events and attempts to freeze their disappearance. We simply cannot prescribe how, why, and what a possible future might make of this documentation. It is always in itself in need of interpretation. So, trying to come to terms with some of these questions, I'm inspired by Simon O'Sullivan's readings of Deleuze and Guattari, and in many respects their work can be seen as a critique of the concept of representation, as basically a closing concept that is at odds with their philosophy's focus on difference and becoming. Much of this thinking is rooted in the Bergsonian notion of genuine difference, or differences in kind as opposed to differences in degree, that becomes central in the development of the concepts of the map and the tracing. Mapping here is understood as a creative practice that entails a qualitative differentiation from what is mapped, whereas tracing is understood as representational reproductions that are already themselves overcoding structures, and I quote, something that comes ready-made, unquote. So, methodologically, Deleuze and Guattari suggests somewhat cryptically, I must admit, that the tracing should always be put back on the map. And that is, it is exactly this tension that sparks Simon O'Sullivan's thinking in terms of an art historyism, which he describes as, and I quote, not an abandonment of, but a re-engagement with the matter of representation, albeit representation in a different way. We might say then that art practice names the careful process by which, within a striated space, organized, regimented, and representational, a smooth space is opened up, end quote. O'Sullivan's term art practice encompasses both artistic production in the broadest sense and its discursive framing, including academia and criticism. According to such thought, art has the potential to deterritorialize systems of knowledge, a potential that is not as much about representation as it is about mapping, about creatively engaging with the materials at hand, including representation and its significance and consequences in mapping out new territories. I just need a drink of water. So, without going further into the long philosophical history of such concepts, it seems to me that these notions of deterritorialization, differentiation, and mapping could apply equally to performance and to archiving and to writing. Understanding like this, that performance and documentation or documenting are not in a dichotomous relation, but always in processes of becoming, each on their own terms, the notion of difference enables us, or enables a rethinking and a different engagement with the issues of the live and the documentation, both on the artistic, curatorial, and academic levels of knowing, and the communication and transformation of that knowing into knowledge. So, documenting and archiving, then, should be as much a mapping practice as both curating and artistic practices are. Thought of in this way, the conundrums that comes from opposing presentation and representation might be criticized from a practical point of view that still has artistic meaning and experiential significance at the center, but acknowledges that it comes into being on various other levels than in the lifetime of performance. This involves a very careful consideration in each case, or in the case of each performance, that evaluates and criticizes its own curatorial context and motivations, as well as the framework of conventions, technologies, and traditions that the performance becomes significant within. Thought of in this way, representation as embedded in history and culture is the matter from which we understand performance, and it becomes the matter from which we must again depart in order for others to make their own interpretations. To exemplify such rather abstract statements, in my own practice I've begun to work in a semi-structured anthropological mode, analyzing the positions I'm ascribed and my own interests of knowledge in dialogic collaborations with the artists. Their questioning and transformation of my initial curatorial ideas and my questioning and attempts at understanding the different forms of knowing that these ideas undergo becomes the fuel with which I produce a body of documentation that precedes the finished performances and tries to map them out at their moments of inception. Such mapping is both tied to representing artistic and curatorial ideas and concepts, to social and institutional conditions and disciplinary discussions, but it is also more or less explicitly staging itself as a performance, and as such, it might be encountered and read again as something that is presenting and not just representing, and thus hopefully encouraging all sorts of other performative readings.
Thank you. We'll have a little pause for a little switch over. Just a reminder, we have Oli Sorensen coming from working between Quebec and the UK, États-Unis aussi, US as well, curating audiovisual performance events in London. In the abstracts, I noticed there was quite a crossover between both. I think probably dealing with digital media and archives, so I'm curious to see where they intersect.
Hello. Hi. Ok, merci de l'introduction. Juste pour commencer, je voulais juste dire que je parle aussi bien français qu'anglais. Puis pendant la période de questions, suivant une présentation, n'hésitez pas à me poser des questions aussi bien en français qu'en anglais. Puis il fera plaisir de répondre aux questions dans la langue où vous avez posé. However, I will be presenting this talk in English just to directly interface with the international audience here in the context of this symposium. And so, yeah, here we go. So, I'm going to start this presentation entitled Curating AV Performances in London. I've done other things elsewhere, but this is just a specific case study. Let's call it that way. So I'm going to start with just a little quick summary of what I'm going to talk to within this talk. In the first instance, I will be just providing some initial definitions of what I mean by audiovisual performance and things like that, and then just give a brief account of my own production as an artist, as a practitioner, and how that relates as a curator as well, and obviously how that interacts with my personal experience within London. And then so carry on with a little summary of what this experience has provided for me as a creator, as an artist, but also with the other artists that I have invited and as well as the audiences. What are the experiences that way? And so to finish, I would just want to attempt to suggest how these may help in sharing, how we can shape the art scene in Montreal. So maybe a few suggestions on how we can do that in an audiovisual context for Montreal. So so I just want to clear one last detail before I just go into the meat of this presentation. Talking as a curator as much as an artist, AV performance is kind of specific, and I'll give examples that go in and out of this specific practice. So this is a title, but it's kind of a blurry definition, and it's more of a category. It's more of a theme than a discipline. And I think maybe we can talk more about the differences during the question time, perhaps. So yeah. Okay, so let's start with the definitions in terms of audiovisual performance. What I really mean here is a term that is the product of a fusion between DJing and VJing, so a disc jockey and a visual jockey. So the latter nowadays more associated with club culture and festive environments, and in a way audiovisual performance as a term came about for these practitioners, for like more experimental DJs and VJs wanting to, let's say, call them be taken a little bit more seriously. So during let's say the year 2000s, a lot of people you met were saying, I'm not a DJ, I'm not a VJ, I'm an audiovisual performer, or I'm an AV performer, so a little bit shorter expression. And then some of those better known AV artists, we can talk about. Talk about DJ Spooky. We can talk about Ryocho Kurokawa and TVJ. So this term for me encompasses a pretty wide range of performers, and in essence, the range of tools that AV performers use is again differs in degrees rather than in kind compared to DJ. So it's a similar type of tools. Maybe there are more tools, maybe they're more tweaked a specific way, but the tools are more or less the same. So they're remixing tools, or they're live performance tools in regards to the manipulation of media, so sound or video media. So yeah, for example, all of the above will be using mobile computing devices, so like laptops, obviously, but more and more increasingly we can see tablets and other types of computing devices, or very custom-made devices, but also audio mixers, video mixers, and so on. So this to deliver a media-centric sequence of sound and images enacted by live operators. So this is kind of the rough definition of AV performance for, as far as I'm concerned, as far as my experience goes. And also there's some similarities in terms of narrative content, which I will go to talk about in a minute. So another point I want to make before regarding this type of practice is that it's intimately tied with the activity of curating. If you think about a DJ, what does a DJ do? Obviously, some DJs will create their own music. They'll be producers at the same time, and you can say that about a video artist. But in terms of DJing, a lot more can be said about the way they collect music, which is not only their own, and there's and to sequence this collection of music in a way that will be, let's say, create an experience that's unique to the audiences, or maybe even work with a piece of media, a piece of content that would not otherwise seem appropriate to show to audiences. And in this context, I want to return to DJ Spooky, where with the example of his remixing of the film Birth of a Nation, and he retitled it Rebirth of a Nation. So he's making a very powerful statement in reappropriating a controversial portrayal of African Americans versus the Ku Klux Klan. Everyone's familiar with Birth of a Nation. It was set in the Civil War period of America. It was banned by the NAACP in 1915. So it's a banned film, and it because of the racist connotations. And it's hard to imagine this film shown in a public context, in another context, than being remixed by an African American AV performer. So this for me is a very good example of what we can do in terms of the potential for this particular practice. So now I want to move to my own situation when I relocated to London. I relocated to London in 1999, so 15 years ago, and I fairly quickly entered the world of DJ and VJ, and this was a time when the term audiovisual performance was not commonly used. It was not a term that people used. People were very happy with experimental DJ or that kind of stuff. So according to my peers and my own feeling, London was very much a center. There was a huge quantity of such practitioners, performers. You can think of Addictive TV, The Light Surgeons, UVA, Hexstatic, Diffuse, and many more. But there were very few places to show those kinds of works. There was an ongoing dissatisfaction of, let's say, either going in a club, in a side room of a club, so kind of a side show to headline DJs, or music, more pop music type of presentations, or let's say festivals like 1.0, where they're more screening festivals or alternative film festivals, where they would come to the launch party, for example. And so again, in a very festive context. And what was also for me frustrating, it was that there was a lot of those events that was only like 1.0s and other festivals only showing once a year. So it was something very interesting, but it would go away, and the audience that was available, let's say, to such type of content were not really kept in as a community. So there was not so much, especially for the practitioners, there was not so much a place for them to get a sense of community and meeting place. So this, for me, when I came in as a curator, it was very important to set up. So this is the gap I set myself out to fill within the city of London. So the very first place I did such an event was at the here. It's called AKA. It's a venue next to the N, a club in downtown London, and it was called VJ Culture. So again, just to remind you, the word AV performance was not necessarily the buzzword, and VJ still encompassed as a video jockey, and it was still very much in discussion. Video incorporated audio. You know, if you play, you know, some DVD or whatever, there's by default a soundtrack to it. So this was very much into the context. So people were debating, you know, why do we need the word audiovisual? Videos by default has audio in it. So, but you know, time passed and things happened the way they happened, and now audiovisual is very much a conventional word for the practice. But yeah, so this was a first instance, and then I moved on to the ICA, the Institute of Contemporary Art, which was more of a screening context. And so a sitting down audience, and it catered for another type of limitation. So the limitation was interesting to work with, but still they had some frustration attached to it. But you know, I think from one event to another, what was interesting was to, you know, very much not wait for the perfect thing to come around. I was very much trying to keep myself flexible, and I think the practice also lends itself to this. I mean, a lot of such performers will be comfortable in staging their performance in a wide variety of contexts, like you said a little bit in your presentation. But I think what was really interesting was an event we did in 2007 at Tate Britain. What was part of the Late at Tate series of programs, similar to, I think, what Mac does a little bit in his Nocturne program. Is it what it's called? Nocturne? Something like that? Yeah. So that was interesting. And what was interesting is that contrary to other late events, which are kind of showed in isolation to the regular, let's say, exhibition, the set of exhibitions, is that we stage our events within the exhibition. So this is Hiraki Sawa, quite a well-known Japanese artist, and he was in the lobby. Okay, just before I carry on, the exhibition in itself is at Tate Britain. It's not Tate Modern, so it was very kind of classic type of art that was presented. It was an exhibition of classic busts, like marble, and so we had a very specific brief to not project, for example, on the actual sculptures, and there was a very strict set of restraints. However, there was about 4,000 people that came, and that was interesting, and there was, you know, it was still quite successful, and it wasn't perceived in a way that made it awkward, and it was very much let's say a video integration and audio integration of what would otherwise be kind of a Louvre-like museum setting. So, for example, so at the beginning, in the lobby, we had these more kind of video projected on the wall to kind of an ambient way, but the performance room, which we had, again, collaborations between more music specialists and video specialists. These were performed in a room where you had 19th century romantic paintings, and one of them, I'm not sure if we know, but if we can see it here, it's, I think, with the black one in that corner there. I think it was Géricault's Radeau de la Méduse. So really like classic, like almost, you know, we were expecting to see Mona Lisa in the corner, but it wasn't the Louvre. It was in Tate Britain. But it very, very important. There was Turner, and you know, those kinds of that kind of caliber, that kind of period. So for me, I felt this was kind of a turning point to the things that I was up to. Then the next important event that we did. Okay, let's just carry on with this. Yeah. So this is another room. It's in the Dovine Hall of the Tate Britain. I'm just going to finish off with this one. And so what happened was we had an installation. It was more of a kind of a mapping where just mixing slide projectors and video projectors where they would be projected on the wall. I think we have something here. Okay, this is another installation that was more in the far end of the Dovine room, and Underlap was showing a series of little light boxes that were filmed and later projected on the wall. So you can see the light box. There's not much sound. Is filming just the chopsticks planted on this turning wheel, and there was sound also that was amplified and remixed, and this was done live. So you can see the chopsticks turning when the image is turned sideways. And there's another one here where the plant is on a little turning disc. And that's being projected on another wall a little bit later. Here you go. So you had two images that were mixed together. The kind of snowfall was made with I think sugar or salt mixed down, pouring down and filmed. And these were laser cut images of animals, and they were filmed again and projected. And so we were very conscious when we came into the Tate Britain of the context which we would be presenting in. So we had all these classic marble sculptures, and we kind of I, as a curator, oriented the selection, but also I was very specific to the artists that were presenting, to be conscious of let's say the atmosphere, that the tone that was meant to be kind of respectful, or but I do like trashy music as well, but not in this particular context. Yeah, so this was one event, so I'm just kind of enumerating the events at the moment, and I'll have a reflection on those a bit later when I've done this first closure on it, on this loop. Yeah, so the...
interject, we're getting near our time. So
okay,
yeah,
so...
2 minutes, we just spoke 2 minutes.
Okay, so I'll just go very quickly in terms of... it doesn't look very long when I'm talking. Anyway, yeah. So the last event I'm going to tell you about, with skipping very anecdotes, is regarding the last event I did before leaving London. It was called. It was at the BFI, the British Film Institute, and this was an event in itself, and it was every 2 months. So I really made a point to have something that was not a yearly event, that was carrying on a regular basis, so that people could actually use the event as a meeting place, as a networking place, as well as a place for events to to look at as an interesting, as a spectator, as a punter. And so again, I try to expand on this idea of audiovisual performance by inviting artists such as Zan Leon, which used physical instruments. Yeah, I don't know. Oh yeah, so let's use a few minutes to just look into what I was going to maybe be a little bit critical about what's going on. What I've noticed, when I moved back to Montreal, for family reasons, because my family is here, and spare you some details again. But I approached what I considered a considerable amount of experience in what I've done in London, and I approached a few places like Musée d'Art Contemporain here, and presented. And to my surprise, there was quite a lukewarm reaction. And what I found out the reason is because most of these types of events are internally curated, and I think this is something we should address and see what we can possibly make in terms of comments within this symposium, but also maybe take home and think about a little bit further. And this is what I'd like you guys to come out of this thinking about, is the idea of the invited curator, especially also in more like Nuit Blanche and all that kind of thing. I think this works very well in many places, but I think there is still room to improve, specifically in the context of audiovisual performance, of night events, and things that straddle between video art and performance art and festival, like festive contexts, and more let's say longer periods that can be shown and seen for longer periods, like in exhibitions and stuff like that. I guess that's my plane crash end, so thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, now is the time to open it up to the floor to questions or comments. Is there anybody? Yeah. The microphone's in the center of the... Oh, wait. No, actually, one of these needs to come. Yeah. Start there, and then we'll move it to there.
Does this work? Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you both. Wonderful. I know we probably don't have a lot of time, and I have tons of questions, so I'm going to try and control myself. Rasmus, I'm very interested just in this whole idea of documentation, and also as being a performance artist myself, and a loosely termed curator. I resist that term. Part of my own interest is in creating more fluidity. Fluidity between curator and performance, and also between sort of performance and documentation. So two things I've been looking at is doing multiple strategies for documenting, inviting artists to document themselves or create documentation after, public, like people who are there, who are public observers who document, also creating a formal documentation, and then pulling those together and having a series of different kinds of strategies for looking at the work. So that's, it's kind of, so that kind of let that one go. It was interesting, and it's still one possibility. And then the other thing we've tried as well is to make documentation an obvious art form. So actually hiring and working with an artist in collaboration who then makes a very conscious, almost form of the work in collaboration with the artist. And I'm not, so I mean that both models are problematic in some ways, and I'm just curious as to some of the strategies that you've tried as well, just to create a different kind of way of either making documentation really obvious or providing different multiple entry points.
Well, I should probably say that I'm in the beginning of this project, so what I'm actually producing right now. So my experience is not that big, but I would say that in this respect, I can only agree with you that multiple strategies is a good way to go about. And then I would say that explicit strategies, making the position of whoever documents very explicit, or actually you touch on documentation as an obvious art form, and I would say that, well, if in my practice it should approach an art form, it would probably be some form of writing, but a writing that acknowledges my own knowing and my own turning that knowing into knowledge, and my own very specific, both personal but also disciplinary and academic and all these things, those positions toward what I'm trying to simulate.
I just want to answer this quickly also, because a really good example from, as far as I'm concerned, is Corey Archangel. He did a piece, he presented a piece at DHC, thank you. Basically he bought a collection of records from this techno DJ, and that was the piece. But the piece was bought by a museum, and the piece will have this kind of eternal life, because now the museum has it, and obviously museums have a policy of conservation and things. So what was interesting with that, the whole process, was that the artist I'm talking about, Corey Archangel, used the museum as the archiving facility. Said this is important, ensemble of records, and I'm using the purchasing process of the museum to make it into an archived thing.
Well, I have a question for you, Ollie. I was wondering, relating to the last example you had of the Tate Britain, why were you interested in organizing that event, particularly in this place? So I'm curious about your thoughts. It seemed to me, maybe I misunderstood it seemed to me it was not highly sort of site-specific in the sense that the artists were meant to directly interact with what was already there, or I'm not so sure. That was in a way my first question. And my second question, I'm a little curious about that. You said you invited them to, or you asked them to, and you were considering to have a respectful mode in the way you were in the space. And I'm just curious if this sense of the artist temple, in a way, if that's how, if you've made any thoughts about that as something that could also be broken down a bit, or perhaps is broken down actually with this kind of event. So that was in a way 2 questions.
Okay, so there's a few questions. Why? I think there is, not just me, but I think from my, as far as I know, even within the naming process of moving from DJ to audiovisual performer or VJ, there is a need, this very ingrained pulsion to want to be taken seriously, and I think some of my peers have not been so lucky, and not been taken seriously, even though it is very important work. I talk about Addictive TV, for example, is a great example. They're very, very good, but they've not made it in the same way as DJ Spooky or Diffuse or Light Surgeon, UVA, all these other kind of people that have actually done it. Anyway, so that's why. In relation to the site-specific question, I think it's not necessarily site-specific, but it's site-flexible, or it incorporates it. There is in the jockey element, this jockey, in the jockey element of the practice, I think there is an adaptability that's ingrained in the practice, and I think this is indicative of that example and other case studies, I think. There could have been less respect, but we chose to be respectful in this particular context. There are other contexts where there's a lot more controversial that what happened, but it's for your last question in terms of respect. I'm not sure if I'm answering it, but I'm just trying to open it up and just say this is what happened there, and this is how we chose to address it. But we could have done many other ways.
Got
got a free-flowing microphone. Please introduce yourself as well.
My name is Maryse Morin. I guess the questions and the information can be shared between the room and the panelists. The first one is maybe Ollie, maybe you don't know, but there's a Museomix Montreal coming in fall. It's the equivalent of Hack the Museum that is being done worldwide. It was done for the first time in Quebec City in Musée de la Civilisation in last November. That may be interesting to look into this.
We're talking about Hack the Museum earlier, no?
That was an event taking place at this year's Transmediale in Berlin.
Yeah, it's Museomix is like the French version of the Hack the Museum, which is going around the world right now. They're trying to spread, and I can't say right now the museum because I'm not sure it's been announced, but it is going to be it is going to be held for sure. Okay, so that's, maybe we can talk about that later. And Rasmus, I don't know if you're familiar with Sarah Pink, who published a book called Doing Sensory Ethnography, which I think can be used for creating interesting documents or art objects. I mean, you know, whatever you want to make out of it, but the sensory dimension of it is quite, I guess, engaging afterwards, as it calls for documenting on more than one level. So my question was, I guess I could direct it to you, Ollie, because I was also quite interested into the site specificity of the work at the Tate, and I was wondering, actually you have answered that, but I was wondering if addressing site specifically with images and sound was part of your work, and also how much having the technology disappear and being more like a presence was of interest. The last part, how much the technology, you know, the presence of the physical presence of the technology has taken away so that people become the center of the attention maybe, or, I mean, whatever that would be for you.
And this is our last question, so just...
Well, I think in the last example, in the video part that I showed you guys, I think this is a good example where the technology, you know, I made it quite a decision, a specific decision, not to focus on making a series of events where, on the one hand, it could have been very easy to get sponsored. You know, look at this great equipment that Pioneer or Newmark are doing, and we've got this whole gamut of artists, you know, performing, making a great showcase for this stuff. So this was very much from the start. But yeah, there are also, you know, hackers that, you know, in the examples that we talked about, that do have an alternative version of technology, which is then makes it worthwhile because there's more critique of the market, of the you know, global capitalism or whatever you want to call it. So yeah, but within the context of that museum, within the context of you know, having just a one night to do everything, this is the choice we made, and you know, I think it was contingent on that specific site.
Okay, and with that, we conclude Amplifications, which the title makes me think when we were talking so much about archiving and digital media and archiving digital integrated performances. Amplification is maybe a word that's kind of opposite to the fact that with the digital content and archiving, we're reducing and losing something from the performance. So just something to think about, strategies for documentation and archiving over the time.
Okay, so one tiny little announcement before lunch. We still have 34 people who haven't seen Leah and Fabian yet about tonight's dinner at the SAT. You need to